He had 43 acres of Canadian Shield behind him, a lake that didn't care what month it was, and the first real silence he'd had in 22 years. That should have been enough. For a man who had spent 2 decades doing things governments didn't put in press releases, silence was the reward. Silence was the whole point. His name was Everett Dunne. He was 51 years old, built like someone who'd never quite stopped being in the military, even after the military stopped being his. He had a jaw that looked carved rather than grown, hands that were useful in ways most people never needed to know about, and a way of standing in a doorway that made the doorway seem smaller. He'd retired from the Navy 3 years ago. Retired being a word that did a lot of heavy lifting for what actually happened. He'd come home to an empty house in Sudbury, then sold the house, then driven north until the road stopped being paved, then kept driving a little further after that. The cabin had belonged to his father's brother, a man named Gerald who died alone and left everything to Everett because there wasn't anyone else. Gerald had been the kind of man who kept to himself and didn't explain why, and Everett had always understood him more than he'd let on. The cabin needed work. Everett did the work. He spent the first autumn replacing the roof, and the first winter not sleeping much, and the first spring trying to remember what a person did when there was no mission. There was no mission. That was the part nobody warned you about, not the waking up at 3 in the morning with your heart going like a fist against a door. Not the way crowds felt like a tactical problem you couldn't solve fast enough. Those things he'd expected, more or less. What he hadn't expected was the absence of purpose, the specific quiet of a day that began and ended without anyone needing anything from him. He'd built his whole identity around being needed in the worst possible circumstances. And now the worst possible circumstances were just Tuesday. His wife, Marguerite, had stayed in Sudbury. That was the civilized way to put it. The real version was that she'd asked him, gently at first and then not as gently, to get help to talk to someone, to stop disappearing into himself for days at a time like a submarine running silent. He'd told her he was fine. He'd told her that more times than he could count, and she'd believed him fewer times with each telling, until one evening she'd sat across from him at the kitchen table and said, in a voice that wasn't angry anymore but just exhausted, that she couldn't keep doing this. He hadn't argued. He hadn't fought for it. That, more than anything, was what told him how far gone he actually was. That he'd let her walk out the door and felt mostly relief. He thought about that sometimes in the cabin, about what that relief meant. About whether he was a man who had given up or a man who had finally been honest. He hadn't reached a verdict. He had a wood stove, a satellite phone he almost never used, a shelf of books he'd read 3 times each, and a husky cross named Gable who had been Gerald's dog and who had, apparently, decided Everett would do. Gable was 11 and arthritic and slept most of the day in a patch of sun near the east window. He was not a demanding dog. He did not require conversation or emotional availability, or anything except occasional companionship and a bowl of food twice a day. Everett found this arrangement ideal. It was Gable who first heard it. A Tuesday in late October, the sky the color of old pewter, the lake already thinking about freezing at the edges. Everett was splitting wood out back when Gable appeared in the yard and stood looking at the tree line with his ears forward and his tail doing something complicated. Not alarmed, something else. Everett set the axe down. He heard it then. A sound that didn't belong. Not quite a whimper, not quite a bark, something in between. The sound of an animal trying to decide whether to ask for help or stay hidden. It was coming from the tree line to the north, past the old equipment shed, in the stand of birch that ran down toward the creek. He didn't go immediately. Old habits. He stood and listened for another 30 seconds, mapping the sound, calibrating it. Then he went. The mother was a Labrador cross, black and white, with a face that suggested she had lived more of her life outdoors than in. She was lying on her side in the leaves at the base of a birch tree, and even from 20 feet Everett could see she was in bad shape. Her ribs moved with each breath, shallow and fast. There was a wound on her right flank that had gone untended too long. Not a bite, more like she'd gotten caught on something, wire maybe, or the edge of a culvert. Her eyes were open and watching him come, and she didn't move, which told him everything about how much she had left. She'd had puppies recently. Her belly showed it. He looked around. There, behind a rotting log, 3 feet from their mother, 3 puppies, maybe 6 weeks old, maybe 7. 2 of them were up against the log trying to press themselves smaller. One of them, a brindle male with a torn left ear already, some old injury from before, was sitting with his small chest pointed at Everett like he was the one in charge of this situation. Everett looked at the puppies, then at the dog. He was not a man who needed more problems. He was very specifically a man who had removed himself from situations that generated problems, because problems led to attachment and attachment led to loss, and he had lost enough. He had a system. The system was working. More or less, if you defined working as getting through each day without actively falling apart. None of this was what he said out loud. What he said out loud was, hell. He carried the mother first. She let him, which told him the same thing her stillness had told him. She was past fighting. He got her onto a moving blanket in the equipment shed and gave her water and did what he could with the wound, which was not much. Then he went back for the puppies. The 2 shy ones he picked up without much trouble. The brindle with the torn ear bit him on the thumb, which Everett thought was a bit trittgedmaten, all things considered. He put them in a cardboard box lined with an old flannel shirt and set the box next to the dog on the moving blanket. The mother lifted her head and looked at them, then put her head back down. The brindle immediately climbed out of the box. Everett put him back. He climbed out again. Everett looked at him for a long moment and decided this was not a battle he needed to win tonight. The mother made it until morning. Everett was awake when it happened, sitting in the chair he'd brought into the equipment shed, not quite sleeping. He'd done this before, kept watch without being asked. Out of some reflex he couldn't turn off. He saw her go. He sat with it for a minute, the way he'd learned to sit with things. Then he went and got a blanket and covered her, and went back to the chair and watched the 3 puppies figure out that she wasn't warm anymore and crawl toward each other instead. He told himself he was keeping them alive because it was November, and they'd die otherwise. He told himself it was temporary. He told himself a lot of things in those first few days that he mostly didn't believe. He named them because you had to call them something. The brindle male with the torn ear he named Fletch. Short for nothing, it just suited him. The female, the color of birch bark, pale and calm and watchful, he named Willa. The third one, a male, nearly all black except for a white blaze on his chest, he named after nothing at all for almost 2 weeks because the dog seemed like the kind of animal that would tell you its name eventually. He named him True. This is the part of the story where you expect things to get warm and easy, where the puppies heal the broken man in a smooth and comfortable arc, 3 small dogs filling the cracks like grout. That is not what happened. What happened was messier and slower, and involved a great deal more chewed things than anyone would have predicted. Fletch, within the first week, destroyed 1 boot, a section of weather stripping, and a paperback copy of a Patrick O'Brian novel that Everett had owned for 15 years. He did this not out of malice but out of a relentless exploratory energy that treated the world as raw material. He could not be in a room without testing the structural integrity of everything in it. Everett began referring to him, when speaking to Gable, as the one that's going to give me a stroke. Gable, for his part, had looked at the puppies for a long time on the first morning, and then made a decision that seemed to involve simply accepting them as part of the landscape, the way you accept weather. Willa was different. Willa watched everything. She watched Everett move around the kitchen, watched him eat, watched him read, watched him stare at the wall on the nights when the staring was all there was. She did not demand anything. She sat and she witnessed, and after about 10 days she started sitting closer, close enough to feel. And then one night she put her chin on his knee and he let her, and neither of them made a thing of it. True was the quiet one in the way that very deep water is quiet, not empty, just still. He learned fast and said little and had a way of appearing at Everett's elbow in moments Everett would have said he wanted to be alone. He didn't crowd. He just arrived and stayed, and Everett found that he stopped objecting to it. The satellite phone rang in the second week. It was his sister Paulette, calling from Barrie, doing the thing she did every month where she pretended it was a casual check-in, and they both pretended she wasn't actually checking to see if he was still alive. He told her he was fine. He heard her hesitate the way she did when fine didn't quite cover it. "You sound different," she said. I just came in from outside. No, not that. Different. A pause. Did something happen? He looked at Fletch, who was systematically dismantling the fringe on the edge of the rug. He looked at Willa, sitting upright on the couch like a small judge. He looked at True, who was sitting next to the wood stove watching the flames through the glass with the focused calm of someone meditating. I have some dogs, he said. Another pause. Longer. Ev, Paulette said. Are you serious? 3 of them. Found them in the birch stand. Their mother didn't make it. 3 puppies, more or less. You, Everett Dunne, who I quote, came up there to not be responsible for anything. I didn't go looking for them. No, she said, and her voice changed in a way he couldn't quite name. No, I don't imagine you did. She asked to hear their names, he told her. She was quiet for a second after True, and he knew she was trying not to say something sentimental, which he appreciated. Are you keeping them? She said. He looked at the 3 of them, this unholy small disaster he had somehow agreed to, this additional piece of the world that required something from him. Ask me again in a month, he said. Paulette laughed. It was a real laugh, not the careful kind she'd been using with him for 3 years. He noticed. He didn't say anything, but he noticed. December arrived the way it does in northern Ontario, without ceremony and without mercy. The temperature dropped far enough that the lake groaned at night, the sound carrying across the water like something enormous turning in its sleep. Everett had the wood stove burning by 4 in the afternoon, and by 6 the cabin was the only warm thing in a cold world. And the 3 puppies figured this out quickly and stationed themselves accordingly. Fletch claimed the space directly in front of the stove, which was both the warmest and the most dramatically central location possible, and slept there like a king. Willa slept at the foot of the couch, on a folded blanket she had apparently decided was hers, in a way that made clear that the designation was permanent. True slept wherever Everett slept, first at the foot of the bed, then progressively closer, until one morning Everett woke up and the dog was on the pillow next to him, and had apparently been there for some time, and Everett thought, with something that was not quite irritation, that he had no idea how that had happened. He started sleeping better. He noticed this about 3 weeks in, the way you notice an absence. You go to brace yourself for the 3 a.m. waking and it doesn't come, and you lie there in the unfamiliar quiet of actual sleep and feel almost suspicious. He did not connect it to the dogs immediately. He was not a man who jumped to conclusions. But one night he woke at 3, the old familiar way, heart going hard, and before he was fully conscious he had a hand on, True, and the dog lifted his head and looked at him, and something in that look, steady and unhurried and completely unconcerned, brought his breathing down in a way that nothing else ever had. He lay there in the dark afterward, thinking about that, thinking about the thousands of dollars in therapy he'd declined, the phone numbers his debrief officer had given him, the pamphlets that Marguerite had left on the counter with a hopefulness that broke him a little to remember. And here was a dog, looking at him in the dark. This is not a story about easy healing. He needed to say that to himself sometimes. He was not healed. The things that had happened overseas were still there, would always be there. The missions that went wrong, the faces he carried, the specific particular weight of a decision made in a fraction of a second that you then carry for the rest of your life. Those things did not go away because a small brindle dog destroyed your weather stripping. They didn't go away because a pale female put her chin on your knee. They were still there every day and they would be there tomorrow. But they were not the only things there. That was new. He started going outside more, first thing in the morning, throwing a stick until his shoulder ached, and Fletch and Willa wore themselves down, and True, who didn't chase so much as track, who would find the stick wherever it landed and retrieve it with a thoughtful air, as though he was doing Everett a favor. He started cooking real meals because the puppies were interested in food, and their interest was contagious, and also because Fletch had twice knocked the bowl of cereal out of his hand, and he figured eating something that required a table was safer. He started calling Paulette back, sometimes, without waiting for her to call first. One afternoon in January, brutal cold, the kind that made the trees crack, he drove the truck out to the hardware store in Chapleau to get weather stripping, to replace the weather stripping Fletch had destroyed, and he brought all 3 of them because he hadn't thought through the logistics, and by the time he had, they were already loaded, and it seemed like more work to unload them. He put them in the truck bed with a canvas windbreak and went in and got what he needed and came out and found that a woman in her 70s had stopped on the sidewalk and was looking at the 3 dogs with an expression that combined absolute delight with some kind of personal reckoning. "Are those yours?" she asked him. He loaded his weather stripping into the truck. "More or less. I grew up with labs," she said. "Had one for 16 years. Best years of my life, almost." She looked at Fletch, who had somehow obtained a piece of rope from somewhere and was extremely satisfied about it. "That one's a troublemaker. He's making progress," Everett said. She laughed and went on her way. He stood by the truck for a second after she left, looking at the 3 dogs looking back at him, and thought about the fact that he had just had a conversation with a stranger in a parking lot in January in Chapleau, Ontario, and it had been fine, easy, almost. Like something had greased the mechanism. He thought about Marguerite then, the way she used to say that he didn't know how to let anything in. She hadn't been wrong. He was aware, with a clarity that was not comfortable, that he'd spent years treating the people who loved him the same way he'd treated that equipment shed door in the beginning. Keeping them on the outside because the outside was manageable and the inside was his. He sat with that on the drive home. He didn't solve it. You don't solve that kind of thing in a truck on a January afternoon. But he sat with it, which was more than he'd been doing. February was when it happened. He'd gone out on the snowshoes after a heavy dump, partly to pack a trail to the equipment shed, partly because the kind of thinking that happened in movement was easier than the kind that happened sitting still. He'd left the dogs inside. Gable was asleep. The puppies were fed and settled. It was meant to be an hour. He was at the creek crossing when the snowshoe frame cracked. Old equipment, Gerald's. He should have replaced them months ago. His left foot went through the crust up to the thigh, and the angle of the fall was bad, and he felt something go in his left knee that shouldn't have gone. He knew immediately. The kind of knowledge that's physical before it's mental, that arrives without any of the stages usually involved. He was down, and getting up was not happening. And he was 2 kilometers from the cabin in February, with a temperature of -22 and dropping. He had the satellite phone. He reached for it. It wasn't in his jacket pocket. He'd left it on the table. He'd left it on the table because he was going for 1 hour. He'd left it on the table because after 22 years of operating with exceptional judgment, he'd gone for a walk in his own backyard and made the same mistake as a tourist. He lay in the snow and thought about this for a moment. Then he stopped thinking about it and started thinking about what was actually useful. He got himself upright against a spruce tree. He could put some weight on the leg, not enough to walk normally, but enough to move. The question was distance and speed versus temperature and time, and the math was not good. He started moving. He made it maybe 300 meters before True appeared. He didn't hear him coming. He was just there, materializing out of the white like something the snow had made. His black coat and the white blaze on his chest, standing in the packed trail looking at Everett with that particular look of complete, still attention. "How did you get out?" Everett said. The dog looked at him. "Come here," Everett said. True came to him. Everett got a hand on his back, and the dog didn't shift or flinch. He braced, actually, leaned slightly into Everett's weight. Everett moved. The dog moved with him, steady and even, like he understood the assignment with no explanation given. It took them 40 minutes to cover what should have been 10. The dog did not rush him, did not pull ahead or bark or do any of the things that would have made it harder. He just walked at Everett's pace, close enough to lean on, warm enough to feel through 2 layers of jacket, and they came out of the tree line together, and the cabin was there with its light in the window, and Fletch was at the window barking his head off, and Willa was sitting next to Fletch, watching with her calm, judicial expression. He got inside. He got the knee elevated. He called Paulette, who called him an idiot, with such genuine relief in her voice that he almost laughed. She called the nurse practitioner in Chapleau, who drove out the next morning and said the knee was badly sprained but not torn, and that he needed to stay off it for 4 to 6 weeks, which he did not, but which he tried to. During those 4 to 6 weeks, the following things happened. Fletch stole and consumed a significant portion of a loaf of bread, the entirety of a block of cheddar, and one leather work glove, leaving its partner in perfect condition. Willa sat with Everett every evening and let him talk, which he did more than he expected. Not about the big things, not yet, but about small things, daily things, the accumulation of ordinary detail that constitutes a life. True slept pressed against his leg every night, which did things to Everett's blood pressure that probably cost less than the medication they'd offered him at debrief, and that worked considerably better. Paulette came up in March. She'd never seen the cabin. She stood in the yard in her good coat and looked at the lake and the tree line and the way the late winter light came across the snow and said, quietly, "Oh, Ev, I didn't know it looked like this." "I know," he said. She stayed 4 days. She cooked things. She played with the dogs, all 3 of them, in the yard, with a rope toy that Fletch took so seriously it was almost spiritual. On the last night, she and Everett sat by the wood stove after dinner, and the dogs were arranged around them in their various ways. Fletch collapsed like a crime scene, Willa upright and watchful, True's head on Everett's foot, and she said without looking at him, "I worried about you, you know." "For a long time. I know," he said. "I'm not worried like that anymore." He didn't say anything. He was looking at True, at the even rise and fall of his breathing. "I didn't expect it to be dogs," he said finally. "No," Paulette said. "I don't imagine you planned it that way. I wasn't looking for anything. The best things usually happen that way." She paused. "Gerald was the same, you know, kept to himself his whole life, and then his neighbor's old retriever started coming around and he let her in, and that was it. He talked about that dog like—" She stopped. "You remind me of him sometimes. That's not an insult." Everett thought about Gerald, about the man who'd left him 43 acres and a lake and a cabin that needed work, who'd died alone but who apparently had not always been lonely. There was a difference between those two things and he was only just beginning to understand it. In April he called Marguerite. He didn't plan it. He picked up the satellite phone on a Saturday morning and called her, and she answered after 2 rings, and he said her name and she said his name, and then neither of them said anything for a moment that was neither comfortable nor uncomfortable but just honest, like 2 people who knew each other too well to pretend. "I have dogs," he told her. A pause. "How many?" 3. "Found them in the fall. Their mother died. Of course you kept them." But her voice was not unkind. "Are you—" She stopped and restarted. "Are you okay up there, Everett?" "Really?" He looked at the 3 of them. Fletch was gnawing thoughtfully on something Everett didn't want to identify. Willa was at the window watching a raven work the edge of the ice. True was next to Everett's chair, his head raised, his eyes on Everett's face with that steady attention that Everett had come to recognize as a kind of care, not demanding, not conditional, just present. "I'm better than I was," he said. "That's honest." She was quiet for a moment. "That's enough," she said. "That's really enough, Ev." He didn't know what they were to each other anymore, him and Marguerite. He didn't know if that phone call was a beginning or a completion, or just 2 people acknowledging what had happened and wishing each other well. Maybe it didn't need to be categorized. Maybe some things could exist without a verdict. What he knew was this. He had 43 acres of Canadian shield, a lake that was thawing at the edges, a wood stove that was warm, an old arthritic dog sleeping in a patch of spring sun, and 3 animals that had arrived without his permission and stayed without his consent and changed, quietly and thoroughly, what it meant to be in a room. He had not gone looking for any of it. He had not, if he was being honest with himself, let most of it in willingly. He had been dragged, inch by inch, across his own line, but he was across it now. That May morning he walked out the front door with the 3 of them around him, the lake giving off that particular late winter smell of cold water and possibility, the birch stand pale and new. Fletch immediately found something dead and fascinating near the equipment shed, and Willa sat and looked at the water, and True walked to Everett's side and stood there. Easy, like this was simply where he would be. Everett put his hand on the dog's head. The lake didn't care. The birches didn't care. The 43 acres went on doing what they always did, enormous and indifferent and very beautiful. It was enough. It was, Everett thought, more than enough.